this is really a huge slap in the face to the civilized world. And I would say a slap in the face to Donald Trump. Just a few hours before this attack took place, his envoy, Steve Witkoff, was meeting in the Kremlin with Putin. And there's this image of him sort of putting his hand on his heart in a gesture of friendship. And then a few hours later, they go and kill a bunch of Ukrainian civilians.
Hi, I'm Fergus McPhee and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. Today I'm joined once again by Sir Bill Browder. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with the tragic news over the weekend that Russian missile strikes on the Ukrainian city of Sumy killed 34 people, including 2 children, and left a further 117 people injured. Now, in reaction to what happened over the weekend, Donald Trump has said that this attack was a mistake. What's your reaction to that and those comments?
Well, this attack was more than a mistake. This attack was terrorism. It was this is state-sponsored terrorism organized by Vladimir Putin and the Russian government, killing innocent Ukrainian civilians for no reason other than to terrorize Ukrainian society. This is what Putin does. This is his modus operandi in every war that he's ever fought, whether it's Chechnya, Georgia, or Ukraine, or Syria for that matter. He goes around killing civilians. That's just how Putin rolls. And the significance of this, though, is that a month ago, President Zelensky, at the invitation and pressure of Donald Trump and the U.S. government, agreed to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, and then the ball was put in Putin's court. Are you going to do that? And not only has Putin not agreed to a ceasefire, but he has launched a massive murderous attack on Ukrainian civilians on Palm Sunday. And so this is really a huge slap in the face to the civilized world. And I would say a slap in the face to Donald Trump. Just a few hours before this attack took place, his envoy, Steve Witkoff, was meeting in the Kremlin with Putin. And there's this image of him sort of putting his hand on his heart in a gesture of friendship. And then a few hours later, they go and kill a bunch of Ukrainian civilians.
Poland's foreign minister said this morning that Putin is mocking Trump in the US with this attack. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I think that Putin has been mocking Trump ever since this whole thing started. Trump has been wishfully thinking that he could end this war in 24 hours. That was his big campaign promise. And what he never seemed to understand was that Putin doesn't want to end the war. Putin has only one objective, and his objective is to completely destroy Ukraine, to take away their sovereignty, to take away their national identity, and to make the Ukrainian people subject to him, to basically rule over them, to kill those who want to disagree with that. That's been his objective since the very beginning, and he hasn't altered his objectives by 1 inch since the whole thing has started. And so Trump has been talking a fantasy about what he'd like to see happen. Of course, we all want to see peace. We all want to see this war end, but we don't want to see this war end on Russian terms. On the terms that Russia wants to end this war would be a complete surrender of Ukraine, an occupation of Ukraine, and then a revenge campaign against everybody who stood up to Russia, a revenge campaign that will lead to torture and murder and other terrible things of many Ukrainian people. And that's not something the Ukrainians want. That's not something that we want. But that is what Putin wants. And that's the only thing that he's ready to accept as the terms of ending this war.
But we know Donald Trump himself doesn't like to come across as looking foolish. And obviously, as you just mentioned, it was less than 48 hours earlier, Steve Witkoff was meeting Putin and then this attack happened. Do you think after this attack, we might see a change in stance from Trump to Russia?
Well, it's impossible for us to get inside Donald Trump's head. None of this makes any sense. The American people support Ukraine. The American people dislike and disdain Vladimir Putin. And when I say the American people, I mean the vast majority, like 90% of American people. And so why did Trump want to be friends with Putin in the first place? It doesn't fit with the narrative that he's representing the interests of the American people. And so what Donald Trump decides to do or not do is a complete mystery because his actions don't reflect the acting in the American national interest.
When you talk about his actions there, a host of European leaders and close allies to Ukraine were much stronger in their comments this morning. Incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, for example, called it a war crime. How does it feel when you see those responses put side by side with Trump's response, which was almost to defend Russia?
Well, it's very disconcerting. I've been personally in a battle with Vladimir Putin since the murder of my lawyer Sergei Magnitsky on November 16, 2009. And in my battle to impose sanctions on Russian officials and the Putin regime, historically, the United States has been the most out front, strongest ally in this campaign, and and in fact, it was always this huge frustration to try to get the UK to stand firm, and and even worse, to get the Europeans to stand firm, and to have now lost that ally is unbelievable. It's truly hard to even process. But that's where we're at right now. Is that the United States is no longer the stalwart ally in standing firm against Russia. There's there's the new regime, the Trump administration, is now trying to almost say that there's two parties at this war. It's moral equivalency. Earlier in the Trump narrative, he accused Ukraine of starting this war, and all sorts of other stuff, which makes it really very distasteful to watch as all of these events unfold.
Do you think Trump's out of his depth in dealing with Putin?
I think Trump is a very clever man. I don't think he's out of his depth at all. He's just got reasons to do things which are not obvious to us. If we had all the information, we'd be able to understand why he's doing these things. But they don't seem to be in the U.S. national interest. They're certainly not in the Republican interest. Most Republican senators and members of the House of Representatives are, again, like the American people, strongly on the side of Ukraine. And so Trump has some personal interest in this whole thing. What are his personal interests? We don't know. We don't know, and maybe we'll never know. But that explains this. And it's not about him being not clever. He's a very rational man. It's just about him choosing to do things that are not in the interests of those people around him.
When you talked about Trump no longer being an ally, is that in your mind, is that just to Ukraine, or is that kind of other Western nations as well?
Well, he's made it very clear that he's no longer interested in supporting European countries in NATO. He's made it very clear that he views Europe and many other former Canada and Mexico as trade adversaries, and so he's kind of doing a America going it alone type of thing, where historic allies, are no longer important, or no longer as important as they were before.
If they are going to adopt this more isolationist America alone approach, can you see some of their traditional allies going with that as well, and almost letting the US go?
Well, I don't think that Europe or the UK really has a choice. This is a unilateral decision being made by the United States, by Donald Trump, and the real issue is, how does the UK and how does the European Union deal with the fact that their main NATO ally, the biggest contributor to defense, is withdrawing? And the answer to that question is that these countries, the European Union and the UK, have to step into the void. They have to protect the national security of Europe and of the UK. And that means spending more money on military. That means filling in the gap where the United States is going to withdraw from funding Ukraine. And it's going to be expensive. It's not cheap. The United States paid a big part of that bill that they're not going to pay anymore. And so there's a very big responsibility to step up and step in. And I think that we're going to see that happening. As you mentioned, the new incoming chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, has he's basically voted on a new budget rule which allows the Germans to spend $1 trillion on their national defense. Just today, Friedrich Merz has authorized the transfer of Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, something that the previous chancellor, Olaf Scholz, refused to do. And so I think that we're going to have to see, and we are seeing, a new behavior on Europe's part, because Europe has to lead instead of follow.
And presumably, when that does start to happen, the world is going to look like a very different place.
Well, the world is definitely a very different place in terms of military alliances, in terms of trade practices, and in terms of the general relationship between countries. The United States used to be the anchor, the rock, the place that everybody looked to for leadership. And the United States is now withdrawing from that position. And the question is Europe going to step into that role so that there is still some true north when it comes to a lot of the things that the United States was doing before?
I want to go back slightly to that day that Steve Witkoff was met with Vladimir Putin on Friday. And at the same time, one of Trump's envoys, General Keith Kellogg, suggested in an interview with the Times newspaper that Ukraine could be divided, almost like Berlin at the end of the Second World War, with support from some British and French troops on the western side. Could you ever see Vladimir Putin agreeing to something like that?
Well, I don't see Vladimir Putin agreeing to that. I don't see Vladimir Zelensky agreeing to that. And I don't see the heads of state of France, Germany, the UK, and many other Ukrainian allies agreeing to that. This is not something which can be decided unilaterally by the United States, and it's not something that will end up happening. I don't know where General Kellogg has come up with all sorts of plans that don't seem to see the light of day, and this is another one of them.
Is there a plan that either side is discussing or might come up with you think would be realistic?
At the moment, there is not, and the reason there is not because Putin Putin is the bottleneck here. Putin has started this war. Ukraine didn't start the war. Russia started this war. Ukraine is just defending themselves. He's the person who can singularly and unilaterally stop this war in a simple way, by stopping the war. The Ukrainians aren't at war because they want to take over Russia. Russia is at war because they want to take over Ukraine. And the only way that this is ever going to end is if Putin decides he wants to end it. And he's not going to want to end it if he's got the advantage. And he has the advantage if all of a sudden the United States is stepping out and saying they're not going to supply Ukraine with weapons anymore. And so at the moment, Putin feels like he's winning. Now, how do we end up ending this war? We end it by those remaining allies who continue to support Ukraine, to give them the weaponry that they need to put Putin on the defensive. Putin will only negotiate when he's forced to negotiate. And he's only going to be forced to negotiate if he's in an untenable position. And the only way we can make that happen is by giving the weapons that Ukraine needs to make it happen.
Is putting him in an untenable position something you can personally see from this Trump administration?
I don't think Trump is going to put him in any kind of position. Trump has shown so far an unwillingness to do anything tough with Putin. He's said a few things that sounded tough, but when you look at his actions, they're not tough. You know, he was tough with Zelensky. He was tough with all sorts of European allies, but he's not been tough with Vladimir Putin. And he's pretty much made it clear that that's how he wants to do this. And so Donald Trump is not going to be the solution to this problem. The solution to this problem is going to be us in Europe, the UK and the European Union.
You mentioned President Zelensky there. He did an interview with 60 Minutes, and he's urged Donald Trump to visit Ukraine before making any kind of deal with Russia over the future of the war. How can Trump and his team go about repairing that relationship with Ukraine and Zelensky?
He could repair it overnight. I don't think that Zelensky or any Ukrainian person will hold a grudge if he wants to change his position and to become an ally again of Ukraine and become an adversary to Russia. That would be he'd be forgiven instantly. Nobody's going to hold any no one's going to care, because it's all about how does Ukraine come out of this thing as a sovereign nation, uninvaded by Russia. But he has to decide to do that, and at the moment he shows no indication of doing that.
During his election campaign, Trump repeatedly said that he could sort of end the war within 24 hours. 3 months later, obviously we know that hasn't happened yet, but there were reports of wanting to get a peace deal signed by Easter. That looks quite a long way off now, doesn't it?
There's not going to be a peace deal signed by Easter, and there's not going to be a peace deal signed of any sort, because neither Putin doesn't want peace, and Ukrainians. The only way that there's going to be a peace on Putin's terms is if Ukraine surrenders, and the Ukrainians aren't going to surrender. So there's not going to be a peace deal, and there can't be one foisted on them. And as much as Donald Trump wants to end this war in 24 hours, he's got to end it on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine. And that means that you can't force them into a surrender, because a surrender means the women get raped, the men get tortured and killed, and the children get kidnapped. And that's not something that any Ukrainian person will accept.
You understand Vladimir Putin better than most people in the UK. I think that's fair to say. While all this is going on, what do you think will be going on in his mind?
Well, there's two things going on in his mind. One is he's just popping the champagne because he can't believe that after, 25 years of being held to account by the United States, all of a sudden he's got an ally in the White House. That's just, an unbelievable thing for him. He can't believe that. However, he's got one problem, which is that in other parts of Trump's portfolio, he's doing all sorts of damage to the oil price. And Vladimir Putin's the one thing that he needs is to have the oil price high. And as a result of these trade wars, which are now launched, that's depressed the price of oil. And if it continues to depress the price of oil, Putin's going to have a real economic problem, and a problem where he's going to have to really tighten his belt. And it may be that the war becomes less affordable. And so on one hand, he's celebrating Trump, having an American president who effectively is his ally. And on the other hand, he is cursing what's happening to the price of oil.
You just said, obviously, having an American president as his ally. We've just mentioned that, Trump's already been in place for about 3 months. Things haven't really moved on. If we're still talking in another 3 months, you and I, where do you really think these negotiations are going to end up by then?
I think that the negotiations will fall apart. There will be no further Ukraine peace negotiations, because there's no way that it can be dictated from afar by the United States for Ukraine to basically capitulate. That's just not going to happen.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report today.
Thank you.